Okay, I think we're back. This is Kara Dreamer again, with another not quite Sunday night episode of Magical Adventures, in which this is a new feature, still a bit unformed, that I'm trying out, where I hope to keep a sort of running log, like an audio blog, if you will, in which I go into how I'm hoping to develop a magical practice, and what I'm studying, what I've been working on, what I intend to do. And I've decided to begin this, however, by giving some kind of just general account of how I got interested in magic in the first place, and what it means to me, because that's something that's changed over the years. And in my last broadcasts, I was talking a little bit about how I had dabbled a bit with neo-paganism, and particularly when I moved to Seattle and joined the Seattle neo-pagan community for a time, which basically meant practicing Wicca or some variation thereof, and then got disillusioned and went on to try to become a Christian, and in fact became Catholic for a time until I fell away from that, and then for a long time I was just kind of nothing again. But before I get into how that changed, because that didn't begin to change until pretty recently, and because of some rather dramatic experiences that occurred to me last year, I want to talk a little bit about just spirituality in general, and how magic, I see magic as connected to that, because I feel that spirituality, that word especially, is a word that gets thrown around a lot and not very well defined, or more, perhaps it'd be more accurate to say different people use it in different ways. It means something different to everybody. Spirituality, and you often find spirituality as put in opposition to religion, often with the adjective organized religion. As people will say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, which kind of implies that you can be religious without being spiritual, which is actually a true thing. There is a distinction to be made. I don't think they're in opposition, however, as is often implied. To me now, having had finally a number of experiences which I would call spiritual, but I'll go into a bit more what that was. Spirituality to me means that I acknowledge that there are certain things, concepts, even beings and entities that have deeper than usual meaning to me, in a way that can't be explained rationally. Like, to pick an example, I find that holding the concept Loki, I think I'm asking for trouble. I don't know why he was the one that I had to name. I just had to. Loki is a concept, if you will, who has much deeper than usual meaning than, say, well, Woden. Even though these are two entities from the same pantheon, that I have what I call a spiritual connection to Loki. And what that kind of ends up meaning practically is that these concepts tends to color other things that I look at, as in I will look at other things that happen in my life and regard them as connected to Loki in some fashion. Because Loki is a very large and heavyweight concept in my mind that illuminates other things in the world the way that a lamp will illuminate or not illuminate certain things in a room, depending on where the lamp is placed and that sort of thing. It's, you know, a spiritual concept to me is a source of light on things, because strictly speaking, nothing that we ever perceive, no mere sensation, no appearance of something, no sound, etc. None of these things actually mean anything unless we have some sort of emotional connection to them. Otherwise, they're just things. And so, to me, spirituality is about emotion. And all the more so because feeling spiritual about something is hard to define in terms of other emotions. It feels almost like a summary of all emotions, or a something that comprises multiple emotions, as in a concept that has more than usual spiritual weight is something that is capable of inspiring a multitude of emotions and not just one. And it's taken me a long time, though, to arrive at this notion of what is spiritual. It's a notion that, by the way, putting it in the way that I've done, in terms of using words like meaning, greater than usual meaning, I'm kind of trying to avoid a definite, an idea that the spiritual weight of a concept or an entity is in somehow completely how do I put this? I think I got a bit confused there. I'm going to try to start this over. So, I'm going to take Loki again as an example. So, I say Loki is meaningful to me. I regard Loki as a meaningful concept. Well, does that mean that I think that Loki has some sort of independent existence? Well, that gets a little tricky, and that's where, by the way, my mind is not entirely made up, because one of the things that I think that you should know about me, and that will come up later in these talks because it's important, is that I do not regard myself, strictly speaking, as a singular entity. I'm speaking to you now with a sort of public voice that is a partial summary or fusion of a number of different internal voices that are distinct from one another, belong to different individuals in this collection, this system that makes up myself. And not all of those people believe the same things about spiritual things. There is an aspect of me whom I've named Mona, who tends to take a very materialistic and kind of positivistic look at things. Is always keen to remind me, look, you can't prove that there's any sort of being called Loki. Loki is a concept created by human beings, and it has meaning because other human beings have put meaning into the concept that we call Loki. And the thing is, I can say all that, and yet nevertheless conclude, okay, so maybe Loki is entirely man-made. Maybe it's just the name that we've personified a collection of ideas, but that is still useful. that doesn't, that does not, that reading of it does not hurt my ability to have spiritual feelings about Loki. But another part of me just basically is willing to go the whole way. It just says, look, this package of ideas, as you put it, in this kind of cold way, maybe it just, maybe it gains life somehow. Like, why can't Loki be a person? Why must Loki simply be some sort of abstract entity created only by humans? And why not believe in the magic, in other words? And that's a side of me that, as you could probably kind of tell just from the way that I'm talking, it's one that I still have difficulty with. The part of my personality that is happiest with it also happens to be a part of my personality who, strictly speaking, does not talk. I have what I imagine to be a draconic side of me, as being partly dragonkin. That particular aspect of me that is most a firmly magical and a believer in magic. Also, when Z is present in their most sort of fullest form, is inarticulate, can't talk. So when I do, my most developed voice is of the materialist. I'm a scientist by education, and it has been a very painstaking process for me to start with that kind of training of mental discipline, and be able to slowly work away at it until it could meet this concept of the spiritual, growing from the other side, from the purely emotional. Because that's basically where I used to be. I've had to meet my current notion of the spiritual, the one that allows me to do things like honor deities and do magic. I was able to do that only because my kind of rationalistic side was able to grow, expand its range of ideas of what it considered to be possible. For that to finally reach out and meet this, at first, very faint, ununderstood, just mewling, weak little feeling, this desire to reach out for the spiritual. And it was only, I have to say, until finally having had some unambiguous spiritual experiences, in other words, real, something that the rational side of my brain could accept as evidence for the reality, for spiritual reality. Once that happened, then things got easier. The pace of my development accelerated rapidly. Before then, though, it was tough. Because, well, I mean, I could talk a little bit about some of those earlier experiences of the spiritual. Because there really weren't that many, and I've referred to one of them already. That deep sense of longing, the feeling that C.S. Lewis described as joy in Surprised by Joy. That deep feeling that I got when I finished and got to the climactic scene of C.S. Lewis's novel Till We Have Faces. And specifically the how could we meet the gods face to face until we have faces line. And so that, for the first real time in my life. I'm sure I had kind of other weaker kind of feelings before. I mean, certainly when I was reading other C.S. Lewis works, I kind of had this sort of, you know, the sense of thing. How do I put it? That kind of sharper than usual sensation that you're reading something that makes sense, that you somehow feel is fits in with reality. I've had similar feelings, by the way, from doing things like solving difficult math problems. It is a genuine emotion. There's a sort of I've occasionally described it to others as a sort of clean feeling, that it's like a cold but refreshing wind that's blowing through you. Like, yes, I understand now. You know, a kind of little shiver can go up the spine. And that's something that I got out of C.S. Lewis in these kind of little moments. And I've come to believe that all such moments are very important. You should never dismiss any kind of sharper than usual emotional response to seeing something or doing something. Even if it just seems like it's irrational in the sense that you can't really connect it up with, like, why would I be feeling this way? It's still important information, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So I'd had these kind of lesser moments, but that Till We Have Faces experience, that was, I think, the first real. I remember kind of like staggering. I mentioned that I was home alone at the time, and I staggered out into the backyard, just kind of wanting to be under the sky, and just sort of feeling like, wow, like, I guess I don't really know myself after all. Kind of, you know, that's this profound sense of empathy with Orual, who had hold of just the wrong end of the stick all her life, and tried hard to be as good a person as she could, but was just never realized until the end how she'd internalized this hurt sense, this hurt ego, this possessiveness that she was never going to forgive her as much as she said that she loved her sister. She never really forgave her sister for leaving her, and she'd managed to kind of layer it up with all this rationalization that it wasn't really that. I wasn't really jealous. It was this other thing. And so yeah, that was a particularly important such moment, and it is because I had moments like that with I can think of a couple of other sort of similar moments also associated with not just with C.S. Lewis, but with other, kind of having encountered other writing along these lines. In other words, kind of sort of Christian flavored writing. For example, I mentioned really getting into the screw tape letters, but so I read them, but then a separate later thing that happened was when I listened to a performance of the screw tape letters on my drive up from San Diego to Seattle in October 1999 when I moved here. I had with me a set of cassettes of the screw tape letters, I think minus 2 or 3 letters, mostly complete, read by John Cleese, of all people, in the Screwtape role. And it was a very evocative vocal performance, and very funny, because there's a lot of dark humor in the Screwtape letters. But then it gets to the final letter, where Wormwood's patient has at last slipped away from him. We've followed indirectly through Screwtape the course of his attempts to tempt the unnamed patient into sin, and how it almost seemed to be working for a while, but then there was a series of setbacks, and fresh influences came into the patient's life, and slowly all of the bad ideas that it just was becoming harder and harder for Wormwood to make any headway, and finally the patient is killed in a blitz, and so we get, by the way, a scene that is kind of like the equivalent of the really sort of weird and problematical end of the last battle, where it turns out that all the kiddies have been killed, and it's like, yeah, you mean we're dead? We're in heaven now? Woo! Okay, that was kind of yeah. The corresponding last letter of Screwtape letters, where a similar thing happens, is quite a bit better written, and I remember hearing John Cleese's reading of it. I actually stopped in a parking lot somewhere in Oregon when it got to that, because I was feeling like I had to listen, and I couldn't drive while I was doing it, and Screwtape is just, his words are filled with a profound sense of loss, actually, that the unnamed human is now able to see and perceive things that the light of heaven and of him is now able to see these things, and Screwtape and all the other devils are never going to be able to. It is too painful to them, and in that I really remember that it's a it again, one feels a certain sense of empathy, with sympathy for the devil, really. That a touch of psychology, almost. The devils are usually portrayed as doing things just because. Yeah, this is we're evil, and this is what we do because haha. So this notion that the reason that there is a sort of profound sense of emptiness at the end of all of this hellish work that we've followed through the course of the letters is it makes it almost understandable, and it is kind of even the bridge for, I think, how to reclaim the Screwtape letters as a genuinely insightful thing for people to read, and strip away all the for heaven's sake, don't go around thinking that it's devils putting these things into your head, that really it's sort of your own it's your own sense of loss that is, in a sense, creating these devils. Devilish thoughts enter our heads not because there are literal devils who put them there, but because our own brains unable to process hurting, unable to process loss, sort of conjure up these demons to try to get something back, to try to get revenge or some kind of something to ease the pain. Anyway, but what I'm getting at is that there ended up being this really kind of definite contrast between the sorts of feelings that I was getting from the C.S. Lewis and from G.K. Chesterton and from Charles Williams, moments here and there of genuine emotional connection with what I was doing, and sometimes punctuated by these more profound experiences of deep emotion that I am calling spiritual. That I was getting that from these Christian people, but I was not getting it from the stuff I was doing as a Wiccan. And that was a real problem, because I didn't really want to be a Christian. I'd never really developed much affinity for anything in the Christian story when I was younger. I wasn't that much exposed to it, of course, but everyone picks up a little here and there. And I vaguely remember flipping through some kind of like children's abridged retellings of Bible stuff when I was quite young. I don't remember. I couldn't have been more than maybe 7 or 8. And it was something I found in just like the school library or something like that. And so I was a little bit familiar with these stories because of that. I didn't get anything from my parents. And then later on, in general purpose anthologies of sort of myths, world myths from various places, there was Christian era stuff. Like in Bullfinch's mythology, there was stuff about Arthur. And I don't know, I just had this general feeling, or lack of feeling rather, in all this stuff, that it didn't really, it was kind of dull to me. I was a lot more interested in the stories of like the Greek pantheon or the Norse pantheon. These were stories that I could actually that were memorable, that were just seemed cool. I know I'm not being very eloquent here. It's just because I'm talking about so vague but deep-seated a feeling, whereas the Christian era mythology is just kind of, well, that's interesting, I guess. Yeah. Jesus. Turn some water into wine. Yeah, that's nice. And if I'd had the wit at the time, I would have attached more importance to this. That here I am talking about how spirituality to me is inseparable from emotion, that it derives, that what is spiritual means what has the greatest emotional depth and inspires in us the greatest depth and breadth of emotion. So if the Jesus stories and stuff weren't doing anything for me on that very basic level, then that should have been a real sign. This is not where you belong spiritually. But still, I was getting these moments of connection with, not from the the Christian stories themselves, but from writers playing with them. That, or writing stuff that wasn't necessarily Christian per se, but which definitely the reason that these writers wrote what they did was because their source of inspiration was Christian. Lewis presumably wrote even the rather pagan-flavored Till We Have Faces because he had such a deep and abiding faith in his Christian God. He was committed to his belief that the Christian God was the summa quo non of all of deity. Sure, he might have gotten meaning out of the Greek stuff, but really it was because they were shining by reflected light, you could say. That God, the one God, was the real source that illuminated all of these lesser things. I don't agree with this reading these days, but let's just say it seemed like maybe a good enough explanation for why I was getting moved by stuff like Till We Have Faces or Screwtape Letters or whatever. That in itself was enough to make me give Christianity a real solid try. That basically right there is why I was willing to start going to church and eventually try to, I didn't try to convert to Catholicism. I did. I was baptized. Whereas I failed to form any sort of connection with Wicca because the reason that I was trying to be Wiccan, it wasn't even a direct one. Like, how do I put this? At least when I tried to convert to Christianity, I had some earnest desire in me to actually literally I wanted to derive a source of strength from Christianity's main mythology. That Jesus reincarnated and all that stuff. That should theoretically be a really powerful idea that I could derive strength from. I wasn't putting it to me that bluntly, but yeah, I was basically trying to buy into Christianity's core myth, that of the incarnation. Wicca, however, its core myth was something that I didn't really get. I was just sort of told that it was something that I could slot my own, basically, there was this sort of, forgive me if I'm really putting this badly, and I guess what I'm about to say sort of betrays how I never really had that clear an idea of what I was doing, so I don't really remember enough of it to give a good account of it. But what I picked up was that the sort of the core myth of behind modern witchcraft, as I learned it back then, Wicca, was that you had this sort of goddess who was really cool, and she had ritual sex with a horned one who was not usually very well defined, and then there was imagery of birth and the cycle of the year and stuff like that in there. And there was like ritual implements that were connected with this. And I was told that this was an adequate generalization into which I could slot particular worship in honor of the gods and goddesses that meant something to me. So I was coming into this in 1999-2000 with a sort of yearning, not very well defined, to form some kind of connection with the Greek pantheon. And I ran into other people who basically said that they were using Wicca in this way, and say, "Oh yes, my chosen god is Apollo." Except, does that central myth of Wicca really serve as an adequate generalization? Can you really say that it contains all godhood in much the same way that Lewis was saying that his god, his Christian god, and his story contained all other godhood in some way? Well, the answer that I ended up coming to was no. It didn't make sense as a connection. All of that kind of, Earth Goddess and Horned One and all the kind of fuss and feathers of Wicca, it had a kind of superficial, or maybe a better word is rudimentary attraction to me, just because it was of something that I've referred to before, which is this sort of simmering but not very well defined emotional need for ritual and for doing ritual things. That was, if there was any source of emotional connection in Wicca that I formed, it was just with that kind of basic thing. Like, yeah, doing ritual stuff was interesting, and I wanted to do more of it. But beyond that, none of the particular mythology and symbolism of Wicca meant anything to me. It seemed arbitrary. It seemed really limiting. And, well, I mean, now it seems even more limited to me. It's terribly gender binaristic with that, strict goddess Horned One axis. Basically that's it. Those are your two choices. Back then, though, I couldn't really articulate that sort of objection. I was more obsessed with authenticity of practice and feeling like, nah, you can't turn all of mythology into this simple story. I'm sorry, and this is not how the Greeks would have done it. Kind of silly thoughts, but because heck, I don't really know how they would have done it either. But I mean, there you go. That's why I ended up actually sticking out Christianity a bit longer than I did sort of ceremonial neo-paganism in Seattle. I wasn't necessarily all that happy with Lewis's formulation either, his generalization, but it seemed to me at least sort of possible. It helped, by the way, when I came across another work by a Christian writer named Dorothy Sayers, who that name might be more familiar to you as the author of mystery novels. She is the creator. Dorothy Sayers is the creator of Lord Peter Wimsey, and but she was also a very intelligent and perceptive writer on theological matters, and she wrote a very good book called The Mind of the Maker, in which she argued that the Christian Trinity was really that the three aspects stood for what she saw as three fundamental aspects of any creative mind. And that, so the Trinity to her was about being a creator. It was about, I can't remember exactly what her analogies were, but it was that that the Father was sort of like concept, imagination. The Son was execution, and the Holy Spirit was like the constant feedback between, like the sort of complex feedback between the creative, both the sort of creative and the executive aspects, but also the audience, and that sort of living connection that makes a work really vital when it's actually kind of responding to its audience and the audience is responding to it. I think I'm messing that one up, but in any case, it was that I was very receptive to theological analogies of this sort, because they made, I didn't feel like I had a lot of emotional bond to the Christian God or to Jesus, but I was at the very least receptive to these kind of intellectualized ideas about him. That they didn't, although they didn't really, in the end, fulfill me emotionally and therefore spiritually, they were something that the rational part of my mind could live with. And that for a while was kind of enough. Especially after the rational part of my mind was just screaming its head off about being in Wicca and doing magic and stuff like this. I had a really hard time, especially with, well, what was magic supposed to do? What was that supposed to be about? And once again, I must apologize for the vagueness of what I'm about to say, because I was vague on it back then. That I had some vague idea that it was about doing, like, impressing your will on things. That you were sort of declare, like that the purpose of a spell was to sort of try to influence things into happening, and ideas that you couldn't be sure that they would happen, but as long as they were sort of in conformance with the will of the universe or something like that, then I don't know. Although I also, during this time, came across some attempts to kind of psychologize magic, that the idea that you were really changing your self and your perception of things, and that made everything a little bit easier to live with intellectually, but it was not convincing, because there again, the emotional connection wasn't there, and how can you hope to change your own mind with something that you're not connected with emotionally? I didn't make the jump. It was just like, I'm trying to do this thing, it feels limp, therefore I'm not going to do it. And so my sort of going through Christianity, I was willing to put up with a lot of how do I want to put it? I was willing to put up with a lot of kind of meager rewards for what I was doing, because at least it was something. I mentioned, for example, already that I regard my my actual church going experiences when I was a Catholic, going to that parish church in North Seattle, that I regard that as basically a positive time. It wasn't like ecstatic, although I will say that the actual night of my baptism was kind of cool. Just, that was the Catholic Church pouring on every bit of ritual power that it had to give on me, including, I remember, a really touching gesture from my sponsor family, my godparents, basically. My godfather was one of the people who was in the choir, and he was actually participating in the mass where he was one of the people singing at the mass where I was baptized. But there was a part of the ceremony where there was like a kind of procession of all the candidates around the church, and we were all like dressed in white robes and everything. And my godfather actually, without stopping singing, left the choir and joined his wife, and because everyone was being followed by their sponsor family in the procession. It was just like, holy shit! It kind of makes me feel a little bad that it all kind of didn't go anywhere, but so I was definitely getting something out of, you know, I was getting at least some of that kind of need for ritual satisfied. The community was all right. I had friends. It was going to church was a moderately social occasion for me usually. Sometimes I would just go and just wait for communion and slink out and not talk to anybody if I was in a bad mood. But you know, at least I felt more supported than I had been in a while. So the satisfaction of all of these real needs in my heart was it helped. And it helped me live with being Christian, being Catholic for a time. But it wasn't going to last, and because I would do these things, but I was also hoping for basically I was hoping for more of those experiences of longing, of joy, more of those moments that Lewis had regarded as signposts. What's kind of curious is that Lewis himself describes them going away. And he regarded that as a good thing. He said, well, those experiences of longing were just signposts, and I got to where I needed to go. So, according at the end of Surprised by Joy, he says, and I'm happy with that. I guess without really articulating it to myself back then, I wasn't happy with it. And now I think Lewis is simply wrong. I think that as long as as long as you are just here in this mortal coil, as long as you're a finite creature, but able every once in a while to really and truly feel that you've gotten a glimpse of the infinite, because that is what a really, really deep spiritual experience is like. As I've said, it's sort of like, it isn't just an emotion, it's all emotions at when it's at maximum strength. For a moment you feel like you can actually comprehend everything and everybody. And as long as we are finite creatures, it seems impossible to me that you would ever stop having such moments if you really had a connection with the numinous, with that which is greater than you. Even if it's just the sort of world of human ideas. And I think the fact that Lewis stopped feeling that way, I think maybe it was a sign that he'd actually lost something without knowing it. He was willing to settle for that which was comfortable and known. As I tried to do, one of the advantages of Catholicism is that once you're doing it, you don't really do anything else spiritually. It's kind of like, well, it's out of your hands. We've discovered the answer, and we are constantly adjusting our way of dealing with it, because after all, what is religion but organized spirituality? Or no, let me put it a different way. I referred earlier to how some people put spirituality and religion in opposition to one another, or at least emphasize how different they are. And you can have religion without spirituality, and here's how. That if a person has a spiritual experience, what that leaves them with, but I think most of us anyway, is a feeling, well, I have this information now. I have these particularly deep feelings in connection with X, whatever X was that you had the spiritual experience about. So I have this information. Now what do I do with it? And, well, one answer is that if you decide that you've had a revelation of some sort, is that you say, well, okay, I had a spiritual experience in which I perceived God. And I feel that what this tells me is that I need to honor God. And that there are certain ways that make sense to me about how to do that, or perhaps I was told this is how I should honor him, and that's, okay. Like, I have come to believe that spiritual feelings they don't need to be acted on. You don't need to do anything about having a spiritual experience, but it is, at the very least, useful to. Religion, i.e., doing something in response to a spiritual experience, whether it's yours or someone else's, it makes sense in that regard. And so I would consider my groping towards a new magical practice for myself is a response. It is religious activity, as opposed to spiritual activity. As in, yes, it is something that I want to do because of spiritual experiences, but I don't feel I'm being commanded to do it. I feel rather that these spiritual experiences are insights into how I can improve myself in my life, and that these are strong feelings that I can tap into and use to help me out in my life. And so, but that's a do-it-yourself religion. That is, and that's by the way, what I really didn't quite get about magical practice back in 2000 was that if I wasn't doing it in connection with, like, basically, if having emotional connections to things wasn't at the root of doing like a spell or whatever, then it was just meaningless motions. I was just doing something because I was being told to do it. And, well, you could honestly say, well, I mean, wasn't that true of being a Catholic? Weren't you just doing things because you're told to? Weren't going to this building on Sundays and sitting and standing and kneeling and singing songs and getting up in a procession to chew a wafer and drink a sip of wine and blah de blah. Like, wasn't all that just doing something because you were told to? Well, yes, it was, but it wasn't something that I felt that was a... How do I say this? In a way, it was okay because it was just something that I was being told, like, basically a body of spiritual authority was telling me, okay, trust us. We know about God, and we've taken in all of the information that we've gathered about God. Stuff that was written down, stuff that's been reported to us by saints and stuff like that. So that's something that I need to emphasize about the Catholic Church, is that it is very scholarly in a way. When it comes up with policy and issues, bulletins and stuff like that, they're usually going back to old religious sources to back up its opinions and doctrines. And I mean, I'm not saying they're correct. I'm just saying they at least tend to be logical about these things, with the stipulation that they are accepting as premises, basically as starting points to their logic, a lot of things that most people think are bullshit. Because if you're an atheist, you don't believe that anyone has ever had a spiritual experience. Basically, to be an atheist is to declare that spiritual experience is meaningless. It's just emotion. And, well, obviously, I've rejected that idea, but I'm getting off the point again. So, basically, the fact that the Catholic Church was able to come to me, sort of, and say, like, hey, look, trust us, we've done the homework, this stuff works, that was enough for me. Partly because, as I mentioned before, I was an academic. I consider myself a scientist, although, the degree that I didn't have a science degree at the time. I had a CS degree and a classics degree. But still, I'd been in school a lot. And I trusted, having been conditioned to sort of trust academic authority, made it easier for me to put some implicit trust in Catholic doctrinal authority. It was comfortable. Well, of course, it didn't last. And, how it came apart was just what I've been alluding to all this time, which is that, yes, there were all these kind of circumstantial connections that I could make with Christianity that enabled me to support a practice for a while. But at bottom, God and Jesus never did a thing for me. Like, I remember attending a mass on Good Friday, and a particular mass. I don't remember exactly the year. Now, the whole Easter weekend is that is the time that Christianity sets aside to tell its most important story about itself, to tell it to the world. And the so I made a conscious attempt to be a good Catholic and actually attend all of the masses that were required of me during the Holy Week, and not just to be one of these sort of Easter and Christmas Catholics. And I could hear the story of Jesus being betrayed and put on trial and crucified, and it was all really very serious and sad, but it was still just a story. I was being told that this that I was hearing wasn't just a story. It was the most important story, the greatest story ever told. I'm sure we've heard this expression. And I didn't feel it. Like, I could intellectually accept the idea of a God that kind of consented to take a mortal form. That was a big thing. Although, in my mind, even that aspect of the Christian story was weakened by the fact that it insisted, that the Christian story quite definitely insists, that the Son is on equal plane to the Father, and that therefore, like, Jesus wasn't a limited form. Like, if I was able to get some kind of emotional analogy to, if I was able to form any kind of emotional sense of sympathy with the story of the Incarnation, it was with the idea of a powerful being willingly consenting to be powerless for a time. Except, you can't believe that. It's a heresy. You can't believe that Jesus was less powerful. You can't believe that Jesus was less powerful than God. You can't believe that the Son was lesser than the Father. They're supposed to be on an equal plane. So you end up with this idea that Jesus basically could have stopped what happened to him at any time, but didn't, because of some sense of, I mean, and this is where it gets this is where it gets really difficult, because it takes all of this and says the reason that this is happening wasn't so that God could learn more about what it was like to be a human, which would have been a story that I think we'd all have more emotional connection with. Insisted rather, no, God already knew everything. He already knew this was all going to happen, but he was willing to do this because sacrifice. I'm sorry, I just don't buy it. I guess at a fundamental level, I've never accepted the idea that that a sacrifice can be basically a sacrifice undertaken on the behalf of all of humanity that somehow is basically good for all time. I refuse to accept that is a meaningful concept. Like, I'm told that Jesus died for me as well as for everybody else. that concept to me just lies there limp. It's like, oh, I didn't ask you to. I'd kind of rather prefer to pay for my own debts, thank you. So yeah, like, there was this nucleus of a story that I could sort of grab, but it's sort of deliberately hobbled with, it's deliberately made abstract and unreal. And so I just couldn't get my fingers into it. It was something that I could repeat to myself at Mass when reciting the Creed, which is something that I earnestly tried to believe in, really. And kind of being able to get at least a lot of it. Like, a lot of the stuff that you might think would have given me trouble as a scientist about Christianity and trying to be a Christian. A lot of the stuff that you would think would get me trouble doesn't, and it didn't. Like a lot of people latch on to superficial things, like virgin birth, like no one's born without sex, and and even if Jesus was, like, all of her genetic all of her genetic material would have gone to the kid, parthenogenesis. Shouldn't Jesus be a girl, and stuff like that? It's just like, pfft. Look, once you're willing to at least even theoretically accept that there is a God capable of affecting arbitrary change on the material universe, then all that's just a dawdle. It's a miracle. A miracle is not something that... Miracle, almost by definition, is something that is impossible by ordinary laws. That it's an exception. So, yeah, stuff like that never... That was easy to get over. No, it was the emotional center. That was what gave me trouble. I couldn't make myself believe that Jesus meant anything to me. You could tell me all you can about all these wonderful things that he did, and about how horrible it was that he was condemned for nothing and died, but he was doing it for us. You tell me all that. It doesn't mean anything. So, eventually I stopped going. The last, well, in its last gasp, my Catholic practice had dwindled entirely to attending Ash Wednesday whenever I could, of all things. I was, by that time, I was skipping Easter, I was skipping Good Friday, I was skipping Christmas, but then Christmas never really did that much to me either. But I felt like I had to attend Ash Wednesday, because it gets down to something very important, central, about all of this fascination with Christian stuff ever since those early days when I was first starting to really get into reading C.S. Lewis and thinking, oh, there's something in this stuff. Ash Wednesday is at bottom a holiday where you're reminded that you're not the person that you want to be, and that, a reminder of two things, really. It's a reminder of that, and it's a reminder of death. You smudge yourself you're smudged with soot, partly as a reminder that you are dust, and the dust you will return, but also as a reminder of your own sins. And hence, Ash Wednesday is the first day of Lent, the 40-day period in which you are supposed to symbolically cleanse yourself of sin by fasting, by giving something up, although I don't know how many Catholics still really try to do this. I'd always try, especially since during this entire time I was still drinking. And I certainly had more than one wish and prayer to that if I could give up anything for Lent, it would be drink. Of course, it never succeeded. But I remind you that what kicked off all of this connection with Christianity was another book, or another thing, I should say, another source, that was largely a reminder of sin. The Screwtape Letters, which is all about temptation, which is all about why people do the wrong and hurtful things, something that I always felt bad about. And I realize now that well, a lot of things, but one of the most important things that I realize is that if I felt so strongly that I was kind of wrong and fucked up, if the idea of being an original sinner had this appeal to me, and if I felt moved to join a religion that almost more than any other is associated with a just omnipresent sense of guilt that you're always supposed to be conscious of. Catholic guilt is almost a joke. If I did that, it was because, yes, I needed to be a better person, but I felt guilt about it because I was brought up to feel that way. That the force that I was hoping would drive me to become a better person, guilt, was not a natural feeling. It was not like I think guilt is to an extent unavoidable, but if I felt guilt all the time to the point where Ash Wednesday was the Christian holiday that meant the most to me, the only one that I went on celebrating, it was because my mom had ruined my sense of self-esteem, and because I felt guilt about even being alive. And it took me a long time to realize that about myself. And, well, let's just say that I'm kind of glad that I got away from a religion that would have inflamed that feeling, because guilt's an awfully poor motivator. Guilt is an emotion, and I think it's possible that any emotion can be used to move one, to help accomplish change. But guilt's a real shitty one. Guilt sucks. And I'm glad that I have found other emotions in my life that spirituality is able to touch. Positive ones. Ones that make me feel like I can build, and not merely that I've got stuff about me that I need to get rid of. Well, I've been talking for over an hour, and I think I managed to kind of, by accident, put most of what I wanted to say in a relatively neat package. I think that's probably going to be enough dwelling on the past for these streams. I mean, there's still some stuff from the past that I want to bring up, because I still haven't gotten around to how I kind of got back into magic. But I feel like that's a different kind of story. That's a living story. That's not stuff that all happened long ago. And so when I resume broadcasting, I don't know. Like I'm doing these magical adventures things kind of as I feel. I told myself I'd just do them on Sunday, but I don't know. The spirit's on me. I feel, pardon my saying it, and I just kind of want to record as much as I can. I've given some thought, by the way, to whether I really should be doing all this stuff live, because I'm trying to alert people of when I'm doing stuff, but it's you know, and I'm trying to do at least some of the broadcasting that I do on a regular schedule. So I really am hoping to build up an audience, but it also kind of conflicts with the idea that I sort of like doing this when I feel that I can talk, when I want to strike while the iron's hot. And I think maybe the compromise is that I'll still be doing live broadcasting, because honestly, I think what I'm doing right now I would never be able to do if I had to rehearse it in some fashion. But I can do this live and tell everyone, tune in live if you can, but still release like podcast fashion and kind of direct people also to that. So I think that's how I'm going to go on doing it, and that's going to make it a bit harder for me to have a regular audience on the air if I'm broadcasting at regular times and stuff like that. But I'm just glad of anyone who does show up. I hope these broadcasts of mine are entertaining, insightful, anything. Because I do enjoy giving them, and it's helping me put a lot of this stuff straight in my mind, just trying to tell it to somebody. So, because I've never really talked about all this stuff at once before. Bits and pieces of the story a lot of people already know, but this is the first time I've ever really just tried to put it all together. So anyway, I think that's enough maundering out of me. This has been good, and so this is Kara Dreamer saying good evening to everybody, and I'll hope to hear from you next time. Good night.